The Star Weaver's control panel screamed in a discordant symphony of alarms. Ken's hands moved frantically across the console, his breath shallow and quick as he fought to regain control. The research vessel shuddered violently, the descent alarms blaring their relentless warning. Outside the viewport, an alien planet loomed closer with every passing second, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The planet's atmosphere pulsed with vivid colors, a kaleidoscope of blues, greens, and purples that should have been beautiful if not for the imminent danger. "Come on." Hold together, Ken muttered through gritted teeth, his fingers darting over buttons to stabilize the craft. The ship groaned under the strain, panels sparking as systems overloaded. He could feel the heat of circuits frying behind him, the acrid smell of burnt metal filling the air. The guidance system was unresponsive, and the Star Weaver's once reliable artificial intelligence could only repeat its emotionless mantra: critical failure. Descent trajectory unstable. Impact imminent. Ken's eyes darted to the exterior cameras. The planet below wasn't on any map in his star charts. Its surface was a patchwork of glowing vegetation, strange rivers that shimmered like molten silver, and towering structures that looked both organic and architectural. The sight was mesmerizing, but he had no time to admire it. He had seconds, maybe less, to find a way to crash without being obliterated. Fighting against the ship's wild spins, Ken angled it toward a dense patch of glowing forest, hoping the vegetation might cushion the impact. The ship hit the atmosphere like a meteor. The hull screamed as friction ate away at its protective plating, and the viewport turned blinding white with heat. Ken was slammed against his harness as the Star Weaver tumbled, gravity shifting wildly with each spin. Finally, with a deafening roar, the ship tore through the canopy of glowing trees and crashed into the alien surface. For a moment, there was silence. Ken hung limply in his seat, the restraints digging into his shoulders. The interior of the ship was a mess of sparking wires, overturned equipment, and flickering lights. He groaned as he unbuckled himself, his body aching from the crash. Stumbling toward the emergency supplies, he grabbed a scanner and a breathing mask before venturing to the airlock. A deep, otherworldly hum filled the air, as if the planet itself was alive. The airlock hissed open, revealing a landscape that looked straight out of a dream. The forest around the crash site glowed with bioluminescent light, the trees radiating soft pulses of blue and green. Their branches swayed gently, though there was no wind. The ground beneath Ken's feet was covered in a carpet of moss that shimmered with every step he took, lighting up in a soft ripple of colors. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet and earthy, unlike anything he had ever smelled before. "Unbelievable," Ken whispered, his scanner buzzing faintly in his hand as it struggled to process the alien environment. The readings were inconsistent, the planet's energy signatures unlike anything recorded in human databases. Every direction he turned, there was something: new flowers that opened and closed as if breathing, trees that seemed to communicate through bursts of light. It was as if the forest were alive in a way he couldn't fully comprehend. He didn't notice the figure watching him at first. Hidden among the glowing vegetation, a pair of eyes observed his every move. Rena crouched silently, her bioluminescent hair casting a soft silver light around her angular face. The forest around her glowed red, a stark contrast to its usual calm hues, mirroring her suspicion and anger. She had never seen anything like the man who had emerged from the fallen star. His strange clothes and alien tools marked him as an outsider, and outsiders were dangerous. Ken felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees. "Hello," he called out, his voice hesitant. His fingers tightened around the scanner, more for comfort than defense. "I come in peace. My ship crashed, I mean no harm." Rena stepped forward, her movements fluid and deliberate. The forest seemed to part for her as she approached, the red light intensifying with each step. Ken froze as she emerged from the shadows, her figure tall and imposing. Her skin bore intricate, glowing patterns, and her piercing eyes locked onto his with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. In her hand, she held a weapon made of what looked like living vines, pulsing with the same eerie glow as the forest. "You dare trespass here." Hunter Rena's voice was low and sharp, carrying an authority that made Ken's heart race. She raised her weapon, and the vines writhed as if alive. "What have you come to take this time?" Hunter Ken stammered, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "No, I'm not a hunter. I'm a researcher. My ship malfunctioned, and I crashed here by accident. I swear I didn't come here to hurt anyone or anything." Rena's eyes narrowed. The forest seemed to react to her emotions, the trees around them glowing an even deeper red. "Lies," she spat. "Your kind always brings destruction. The forest remembers." Ken shook his head, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm telling the truth. I've never been here before. I'm just trying to survive." The vines from Rena's weapon shot forward, wrapping around Ken's wrists and pinning him in place. He gasped, struggling against the bonds, but they were impossibly strong. The forest around them seemed to watch, its glowing light pulsating faster, as if it were alive and angry. "You will come with me," Rena said, her voice cold and unyielding. "The elders will decide your fate." Ken didn't have a choice. Bound and helpless, he could only follow as Rena led him deeper into the forest, the glowing trees casting strange, shifting patterns on the ground. The scanner in his hand buzzed faintly, but the readings made no sense. The forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. And somehow he had become its prisoner. The glowing forest pulsed gently as the vines binding Ken loosened, retracting at Rena's command. Her expression remained guarded, her eyes scanning him as if she could peel away his layers and uncover whatever hidden threat she believed him to be. The forest no longer burned with its angry red glow, but it was far from calm. The flickering hues of green and yellow suggested a wary vigilance, mirroring Rena's emotions. "You will not die yet," Rena said, her voice sharp as the weapon she carried. "But know this, outsider the forest does not forgive. If you bring harm, it will consume you before I ever need to act." Ken rubbed his wrists where the vines had constricted. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. If you could just let me." Rena cut him off with a glare. "Enough. Your words mean nothing without proof. Follow me. The night is dangerous, even for those the forest tolerates." Ken hesitated, glancing back at the ruined remains of the Star Weaver. Smoke still rose faintly from its hull, its once sleek structure now battered and scarred. He felt an ache in his chest. The ship was more than just transportation, it was his lifeline, his connection to home. But staying behind wasn't an option, not with the forest alive in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Reluctantly, he nodded and followed Rihanna as she turned and began walking. The journey through the forest was unlike anything Ken had ever experienced. The bioluminescent plants glowed brighter wherever Rihanna stepped, as if bowing to her presence. The moss beneath their feet pulsed faintly in rhythm with her movements. When Ken tried to step off the narrow path, the ground stiffened beneath him, almost as if rejecting him. "It responds to you," Ken said, his voice filled with awe. "The forest. It's alive, isn't it? Truly alive." Rihanna didn't slow her pace. "The forest is more than alive. It is Arza. It is us. And it does not trust you." Her words hung heavily in the air. Ken studied her as they walked, noting the way her bioluminescent patterns shifted subtly, glowing brighter or dimmer in tandem with her emotions. It was like a second language, one he couldn't understand but desperately wanted to. Every now and then, Rihanna would glance back at him, her expression unreadable. Was she assessing him? Waiting for him to slip up? He couldn't tell. As night fell, the forest's glow became more intense, casting ethereal shadows that danced with their movement. The sounds around them shifted too, soft hums and whispers replacing the rustling of leaves. Ken shivered. He felt watched, not just by Rihanna but by the forest itself. "Keep close," Rena warned. "The forest protects us during the day, but at night it tests us. Stray and you will not survive." Ken's mouth went dry at her words. He didn't ask what she meant. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move as if something unseen prowled just beyond the light. He quickened his pace, staying close behind Rena until they reached the base of a towering cliff. Here, the forest gave way to jagged rock, glowing with faint veins of green energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. High above, a series of caves dotted the cliffside, their entrances framed by luminous vines. "This way," Rena said, beginning to climb. Ken followed, his muscles burning with the effort. The climb was treacherous, the rock slick in places where the glowing veins pulsed. When they finally reached the top, he collapsed onto the stone floor, panting. "Not much of a hunter," Rena muttered, her tone carrying a trace of amusement. "I told you. I'm not a hunter," Ken said, exasperation seeping into his voice. He sat up, brushing dirt from his hands. "I'm a researcher. I'm here to learn, to explore." Rena gave him a long, searching look before finally speaking. "You say you're here to learn? Then you'll start tonight. The elders will want proof of your intentions, but first you must understand what your kind has done." She motioned for him to follow as she led him deeper into the cave. Inside, the walls glowed faintly, patterns of light that seemed to tell a story. Rena stopped before a particularly intricate section, gesturing for him to look. "This is our history," she said. "Your people came here generations ago, long before my time. They called themselves engineers, and they claimed they wanted to study Arza. But they lied. They took pieces of the forest, broke them, twisted them. They changed us, too." Ken stared at the glowing patterns, his breath catching as he realized they depicted humanoid figures, some that resembled Rena, others clad in strange suits that reminded him of ancient exploration gear. The figures worked with tools, cutting into the glowing trees. The forest around them burned, its light turning red in anger. "I had no idea," Ken said softly. "I'm not like them. I would never." Words Rena interrupted. "If you truly mean what you say, then you will prove it. Tomorrow you will face the circle of resonance." Ken frowned. "What is that?" "A trial," Rena said. "You will stand before the forest itself. If you are honest in your intentions, the forest will accept you. If not, it will destroy you." Ken felt a lump rise in his throat. "And what if I refuse?" Rena's eyes narrowed. "Then I will assume you are a threat, and I will end you myself." That night, Ken slept fitfully in the high cave, haunted by the stories Rena had told him. When dawn broke, she roused him early, her expression unreadable. Together, they descended back into the forest, which seemed to glow with an anticipatory energy. Other figures waited in a clearing, their glowing patterns marking them as Rena's people. They watched Ken with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. At the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, each one etched with intricate patterns that glowed faintly. Rena motioned for him to step inside. "The circle of resonance," she said. "Stand there. Open yourself to the forest. It will judge you." Ken hesitated, but finally stepped into the circle. The moment his feet touched the stones, the glow intensified, and he felt a strange warmth spreading through his body. The forest seemed to hum, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. He closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation. At first, it was overwhelming. The hum grew louder, almost painful, and he felt as though he might be torn apart. But then he let go of fear, of doubt, of his need to control. He opened himself fully to the forest, letting its energy flow through him. The pain faded, replaced by a profound sense of connection. He felt the forest's awareness, its curiosity, its cautious hope. When Ken opened his eyes, the clearing was bathed in a brilliant light. The forest pulsed with a gentle, welcoming glow, and the people watching gasped in astonishment. Even Rena seemed taken aback, her bioluminescent patterns flickering in a way that suggested surprise. "The forest has accepted you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with wonder. "Perhaps. You are different after all." The glow of the forest remained gentle and warm as Ken stepped out of the circle of resonance, though his body trembled from the overwhelming experience. He ran a hand over his arm, where faint, Shimmering lines had begun to appear, glowing in hues that mirrored the forest's vibrant greens and blues. He hadn't noticed them at first, but now the pattern seemed alive, shifting faintly beneath his skin. The sensation was strange, not unpleasant, but deeply foreign. He turned to Riina, his voice hesitant. "Is this normal?" he asked, holding up his arm to show the glowing marks. Riina's eyes widened, and for a moment, her guarded composure broke. "It is. Unexpected," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the patterns. "The forest has bonded with you. It has never done this to one of your kind before." The gathering of Arzan elders, who had watched the trial in silence, began murmuring among themselves. Their glowing patterns flickered in confusion and apprehension, a stark contrast to the forest's calm. One elder stepped forward, his voice steady but cautious. "This is dangerous," the elder said, his gaze sharp. "The bond is meant for us, for those who are born of the forest. If it has extended itself to an outsider, what does this mean for our harmony, for our survival?" Ken shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their stares. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice earnest. I wanted to prove that I mean no harm. I still don't understand what's happening, but I promise I'm not here to disrupt anything." Riina stepped forward, her tone firm. "The forest does not make mistakes. It chose him for a reason, even if we do not understand it yet. Perhaps this is an opportunity, not a threat." The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Some nodded reluctantly, while others remained skeptical. Finally, the eldest among them raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "The forest has spoken, and we must listen. But he must tread carefully. If this bond grows, it could change the balance we have preserved for generations. We will watch, and we will wait." As the elders dispersed, Riina turned to Ken, her expression softening. "You are different now," she said, gesturing to the glowing lines on his skin. "The forest is a part of you, just as it is a part of us. You will need to learn how to live with it." Ken nodded, though he felt a twinge of anxiety. The forest's energy was a constant presence now, like a second heartbeat thrumming in his chest. It was both comforting and unnerving, a reminder that he was no longer entirely himself. In the days that followed, Ken and Riina spent more time together, working to repair the Star Weaver. The ship's damage was extensive, and finding the necessary materials proved challenging in Arza's wild and unpredictable environment. Despite the tension between them, their interactions began to shift. Ken's curiosity about Erza's culture was genuine, and Riina found herself softening as she saw his determination to understand her world. One afternoon, as they worked to replace a damaged panel on the ship, Ken glanced at Riina and grinned. "You know, for someone who thought I was a dangerous hunter, you're being surprisingly helpful." Riina raised an eyebrow, her tone dry. "Don't mistake this for trust. If you start acting suspicious, the vines are ready." Ken laughed, shaking his head. "Noted. But seriously, thank you. I don't think I could do this alone." Riina didn't respond immediately, but her bioluminescent patterns flickered faintly, a sign of warmth she wasn't yet ready to voice. Instead, she pointed to a pile of tools. "Pass me that wrench. The forest may trust you, but I don't trust this ship not to explode." As they worked, the forest seemed to mirror their growing connection. The plants around the ship glowed brighter, their light steady and calm. Ken noticed the patterns on his skin reacting too, shifting subtly whenever he and Riina exchanged words or laughter. It was as if the forest itself was cheering them on, though Riina dismissed the idea when he mentioned it. Their newfound rhythm was put to the test when the elders summoned them for a new task. A site deep within Arza had been deemed off limits for years, its energy deemed cursed and dangerous. It was the site of one of the original hunter ships, a vessel like Ken's Star Weaver that had crash-landed generations ago. The forest had never forgiven the destruction the hunters brought, and the area was a chaotic tangle of unstable energy. "The ship's remains may have materials you can use to complete your repairs," one elder explained, his tone cautious. But the forest's anger still lingers there. If you disturb it carelessly, you risk awakening its wrath. Ken glanced at Riina, who met his gaze with a serious expression. "We'll need to be careful," she said. "The forest may have accepted you, but this place is different. It remembers pain." The journey to the forbidden site was long and tense. The forest's glow grew dimmer as they approached, its usual vibrancy replaced by faint, flickering light. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made Ken's skin prickle. When they finally reached the site, Ken stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. The wreckage of the hunter ship was sprawled across a charred clearing, its metal hull twisted and corroded. Vines and roots had grown over it, their glowing light subdued and sickly. The ground was scorched, the forest's usual lushness replaced by barren, cracked earth. Riina placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay close. The forest here is not the same. It will test you." Ken nodded, his voice quiet. "I'll be careful." As they approached the wreckage, Ken felt the bond with the forest intensify. The glowing patterns on his skin flickered erratically, reacting to the chaotic energy around him. He closed his eyes, focusing on the steady rhythm he had felt during the trial. Slowly, he reached out with his mind, trying to harmonize with the forest's energy. It was like walking a tightrope. The energy around him was wild and unbalanced, lashing out in sharp bursts. But as Ken focused, the patterns on his skin began to stabilize, glowing with a soft, steady light. The chaotic energy around him seemed to calm, the forest responding to his presence. Riina watched in awe as Ken navigated the dangerous zone, his connection to the forest guiding him. She had doubted him at first, but now she couldn't deny the bond he had formed. When they finally reached the wreckage, Ken carefully extracted the materials they needed, his movements precise and deliberate. As they left the site, the forest's light began to brighten, its energy shifting from anger to cautious acceptance. Riina glanced at Ken, her expression unreadable. "You did well," she said finally. "The forest trusts you more than I expected." Ken smiled, his relief evident. "Does that mean you trust me too?" Riina's patterns flickered faintly, her lips curving into a small, reluctant smile. "Perhaps, but don't get used to it." For the first time since his crash, Ken felt a spark of hope. The forest had accepted him, and perhaps Riina had too. Together they had begun to mend not just his ship, but the fragile bond between their worlds. The elders gathered in a circle, their glowing patterns flickering in shades of caution and anticipation. The forest around them seemed to hum with quiet intensity, its energy vibrating faintly underfoot. Ken stood in the center of the gathering, his skin still glowing with the patterns that had marked him since the circle of resonance. Beside him, Riina stood tall, her presence both reassuring and grounding. Though she had been skeptical of him at first, her stance now was one of solidarity. "This bond between you and the forest is unprecedented," the eldest elder began, his voice steady but laced with concern. "It has chosen you, but we cannot rely on faith alone. You must show us that this connection is more than an accident of fate. You and Riina will perform a demonstration of resonance that proves your unity with the forest and with each other." Ken exchanged a glance with Riina, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "What exactly do we have to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. "The forest will guide you," the elder said simply. "If your connection is true, you will know." Ken took a deep breath, nodding. Riina's expression remained composed, but the subtle flicker of her glowing patterns betrayed her own apprehension. Without a word, she reached out and took Ken's hand, the gesture both practical and unexpectedly comforting. The forest around them began to stir, its bioluminescent light shifting from calm greens and blues to a vibrant gold. The gathered Urzans stepped back, their own patterns dimming as if to give the forest space to speak. Ken closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythm he had felt so many times since arriving on Arza. The hum of the forest grew louder, resonating deep within his chest. Riina's grip on his hand tightened, and he felt her energy intertwine with his own. The patterns on their skin began to glow brighter, shifting and flowing in perfect harmony. Ken opened his eyes, and for a moment the world seemed to blur. The forest's light surged upward, forming intricate shapes and patterns that danced in the air above them. It was a symphony of color and energy, a living tapestry that spoke of unity and understanding. The elders watched in stunned silence as the forest's energy enveloped Ken and Rena, their connection undeniable. The demonstration wasn't just a spectacle, it was a conversation, a shared moment between two beings and the living world that surrounded them. When the light finally faded, the silence that followed was profound. The eldest elder stepped forward, his expression one of reverence. "The forest has spoken. Your connection is true." Ken exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a smile breaking across his face. Beside him, Rena allowed herself a small smile as well, though her glowing patterns betrayed the depth of her relief and pride. With the demonstration complete, the mood among the Arzans shifted. The initial skepticism of the elders began to dissolve, replaced by cautious optimism. The Star Weaver, now partially repaired and infused with bioluminescent energy from the forest, stood ready for departure. The elders, after much deliberation, agreed to allow Rena to leave with Ken as an ambassador, a bridge between their world and the wider galaxy. On the day of their departure, the forest seemed to come alive with vibrant light, its colors a vivid farewell. Arzan warriors and elders gathered near the Star Weaver, their glowing patterns reflecting a mixture of hope and sadness. For many, the idea of leaving Arza was unthinkable, but the forest's acceptance of Ken and Rena's bond had opened the door to a new future. As Ken and Rena prepared to board the ship, their banter lightened the solemn mood. "You know," Ken said with a grin, "if someone had told me I'd end up with glowing skin and a forest-approved warrior by my side, I'd have thought they were crazy." Rena raised an eyebrow, her tone dry but tinged with affection. "And if someone had told me I'd leave Arza with an outsider who barely knows how to climb a tree, I'd have bound them in vines." Ken laughed, shaking his head. "I guess we're both full of surprises." As they stepped onto the Star Weaver, the ship's systems hummed to life, now powered by the forest's energy. The glowing patterns on its hull mirrored those on Ken and Rena's skin, a testament to the bond they had forged. The Arzans watched as the ship lifted off, their glowing patterns pulsing in unison with the forest's light. From the viewport, Ken and Rena gazed at the planet below. Arza's bioluminescent forests stretched out like a sea of light, a living entity that had forever changed their lives. As the Star Weaver ascended, the forest sent out a final display of brilliance, its light reaching into the sky as if to touch the stars. Ken turned to Rena, his voice soft. "Do you think they'll be okay without you?" Rena's expression was thoughtful, her patterns glowing faintly. "The forest is strong. It always has been. But this is a chance for something new. For all of us." Ken nodded, his own patterns flickering in agreement. "Then let's make the most of it." The Star Weaver disappeared into the vast expanse of space, carrying with it the hopes of two worlds. Ken and Rena sat side by side in the cockpit, the stars stretching out before them. Though their journey was just beginning, the bond they shared and the connection to the living forest of Arza promised a future filled with possibility. Behind them, the forest light dimmed gently, its presence a quiet reminder of home.